On the night of January 23, 1961, the United States came closer to destroying itself than it ever has before or since. Not by the hand of an enemy, not by miscalculation in some distant war room, by accident, by a structural failure in a wing, by fuel leaking in the dark at 40,000 feet over the American South. 2 hydrogen bombs fell from a disintegrating aircraft over a small tobacco farming county in North Carolina, and one of them, a weapon 250 times more powerful than the bomb, dropped on Hiroshima, went through nearly every single step required for detonation. Not most of the steps, nearly all of them. The engineers who later examined it found that a single low-voltage switching mechanism, a component so simple it belongs in a household circuit, was the only thing standing between a quiet Tuesday night and the vaporization of everything within miles, followed by fallout reaching as far north as New York, as far south as Atlanta. The United States government knew this. They classified it for decades, and most Americans still don't know it happened. This is what almost occurred on American soil, in America's own backyard, without a single enemy involved. To understand what happened over Goldsboro, North Carolina, you have to understand the world that made it possible, because this story doesn't begin with the mechanical failure. It begins with fear, with the particular all-consuming, institutional fear that gripped the United States in the years following World War II, a fear so deep it reorganized the entire structure of American military power and set the conditions for this night. By January of 1961, the Cold War wasn't an abstraction. It was the architecture of daily life. It was the tension in every diplomatic cable, every intercepted transmission, every military briefing. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear weapon in 1949, 12 years before this night, and in the years that followed, both superpowers had accelerated toward arsenals of a scale that would have seemed like pure science fiction to any previous generation. The arms race wasn't merely a competition, it was a doctrine. Both nations had concluded, in their respective war rooms, that the only true deterrence was the credible, constant threat of total annihilation. You keep the peace by promising destruction. That was the logic. That was the foundation everything rested on. And to make that threat credible, weapons had to be ready, not prepared in some distant silo, waiting to be unlocked, authorized, armed in sequence, ready in the air, at all times. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, was the American instrument of that readiness. It was the most powerful military organization in human history, built around a single consuming objective: ensure that the United States could deliver a nuclear strike at any moment, under any circumstances, even if the homeland itself was already burning. To achieve this, SAC kept bombers in continuous rotation, flying long-endurance patrols over the continental United States and beyond. If the order came, they would already be airborne, already pointed outward, already armed. Those bombers carried real weapons, live hydrogen bombs, secured aboard aircraft that flew thousands of hours through all weather, at all altitudes, crewed by men who understood the weight of what they carried, but who also, because they were human, experienced fatigue, distraction, mechanical failure, bad luck. On the night of January 23rd, a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress assigned to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro was conducting a routine airborne alert mission. It was a large aircraft with 180 feet of swept-wing aluminum and steel, roughly the length of a modest passenger liner standing on its nose. At altitude, it encountered a serious fuel leak in the right wing. The leak became critical. The aircraft lost structural integrity, and somewhere over Wayne County, North Carolina, over fields that would soon be frost-hardened and dark, over the kind of country where you can hear a dog bark across 2 miles of empty air, the aircraft broke apart. The crew attempted to bail out. Some survived, some did not, and the 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs the aircraft was carrying were released. They fell through the cold January air, turning end over end in the dark above a sleeping American county, above people who had no idea what had been flying over their heads, above roads and farmhouses, and small lives completely unaware that the most destructive technology ever assembled by human beings had just come loose above them. what happened next and what those weapons did, and what prevented them from doing something else entirely. That is where this story truly begins. Because it is a story not just about a mechanical failure on a cold January night. It is a story about the systems men build when they believe they can control the uncontrollable, and what happens when those systems meet reality. The men who flew those missions were not reckless. That is the first thing worth understanding. They were selected, trained, and psychologically screened with a rigor few institutions ever apply. The Strategic Air Command did not recruit for bravado. It recruited for steadiness, guns for the human ability to carry an enormous responsibility across hundreds of hours of monotonous sky without letting the weight of it crack your judgment. These were professionals in the most demanding sense of the word. And on the night the aircraft went down over Goldsboro, the crew of that B-52 behaved exactly as they had been trained to behave. They tried to save the aircraft. When they could not, they tried to save themselves. Most of them managed it. The failure that night was not human. It was structural. It was systemic. And that distinction matters enormously. Major Walter Tulloch was the aircraft commander. He and his crew had done this before. Long airborne patrols. Hours of disciplined routine above an indifferent continent. The calm of men who understood that readiness was not a posture, but a condition you maintained whether anything was happening or not. When the fuel crisis developed, Tulloch followed procedure. He contacted the base. He tried to manage the situation in the air. But the leak was too severe and the structural damage was advancing faster than the options available to him. At some point, the moment that comes in every real emergency, if the situation passed beyond recovery, the order to abandon the aircraft was given. The crew went out into the dark. What Tulloch and his crew could not know, as they descended by parachute over a quiet North Carolina county in the earliest minutes of a Tuesday morning, was what was already happening below them, what the bombs were doing in the dark. To understand the weight of what followed, you have to understand what those weapons were. The Mark 39 was not a primitive device. By 1961, it represented more than 15 years of American weapons development, a thermonuclear bomb with a yield of about 3.8 megatons. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 had a yield of roughly 15 kilotons. The Mark 39 was somewhere between 200 and 250 times more powerful. A single detonation over a populated area would not simply destroy a city. It would erase it. The thermal pulse alone would ignite fires across a vast radius. The blast would flatten reinforced structures miles away, and the fallout carried by the fireball and the wind would spread radioactive debris across hundreds of miles of American countryside, creating a public health catastrophe with no precedent on this soil. 2 of them had just been dropped by a disintegrating aircraft over North Carolina. The political context of that moment cannot be separated from the physical one, because the pressure that put those bombs in the air that night was not accidental. It was chosen. It was the product of deliberate policy, developed across 2 American administrations, refined and expanded by the Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay, who believed with absolute conviction that the only credible deterrence was constant, overwhelming readiness. LeMay had built SAC in his own image, demanding, precise, intolerant of half measures. Under his leadership, the command had grown into an organization of extraordinary capability and in ways that were not yet fully visible. Extraordinary risk. The Airborne Alert Program, Operation Chrome Dome, kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air around the clock. At any given moment during the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were American aircraft carrying live nuclear weapons somewhere over the continental United States or its approaches. This was not a secret kept from the public out of embarrassment. It was policy, maintained openly as a demonstration of resolve. The weapons in the air were the message. The message was, we are ready. We will always be ready. What the public was not told What the institutional culture of SAC actively discouraged examining too closely was the arithmetic of that readiness. If you fly enough aircraft, enough hours, across enough years, through enough weather systems and mechanical contingencies and human variables, probability does not sleep. The question was never truly whether an accident would happen. The question was what kind of accident it would be, and what would stand between that accident and catastrophe. By January of 1961, that question had been quietly raised inside the weapons design community. Not loudly, not in ways that threatened the program or the doctrine, but raised nonetheless by people who understood the engineering well enough to feel a specific, technical unease about what might happen when a weapon system met an uncontrolled sequence of events. One of those people was a physicist named Robert Purifoy. He worked at Sandia National Laboratories, the institution responsible for the non-nuclear components of American nuclear weapons, the arming systems, the safing mechanisms, the engineering architecture that was supposed to ensure a weapon only did what it was told. Purifoy was methodical, precise, not given to alarm. But what he and his colleagues had been examining in the years before Goldsboro had left him with conclusions he could not ignore. Conclusions about what American nuclear weapons would actually do under abnormal conditions. Conclusions that the military had received, considered, and in the pressure of the larger program, not fully acted upon. He was about to find out how right he had been. The first bomb deployed its parachute. That detail is important. It means the weapon functioned, not in the sense that anyone wanted it to function, but in the sense that its internal systems, responding to the conditions of a free fall from a disintegrating aircraft, began moving through their designed sequence. The parachute was part of that sequence. It was there to slow the weapon's descent, to give the delivering aircraft time to escape the blast radius. On the night of January 23rd, there was no aircraft to protect. There was only a quietly opening canopy above a thermonuclear bomb, descending in an almost gentle arc toward a field outside Goldsboro, North Carolina. It came down relatively intact. It landed in a tree. And when the recovery teams reached it in the hours and days that followed, what they found in the weapons arming system stopped some of them cold. The Mark 39 was designed with multiple safeguards, a layered series of interlocks, and switches meant to ensure the weapon could not detonate unless every step in the proper sequence had been completed in order, under authorized conditions. This was the engineering answer to the obvious problem of putting live nuclear weapons inside aircraft that flew through turbulence, lightning, mechanical failure, and the 1,000 other conditions that real flight produces. The safeguards were the argument that this was manageable, that the risk was controlled, that the arithmetic was acceptable. On the first bomb, investigators found that 3 of those safeguards had failed. The arming sequence had progressed further than it should have been possible for it to progress under accident conditions. The weapon had come closer to an armed state than the system was ever supposed to allow. A single switch, one safing mechanism, carrying a low-voltage current, a component of a type you might find in an ordinary piece of electrical equipment, had not closed. That was it. That was the margin. Not a sophisticated redundancy, not the product of some deep layer of carefully engineered protection. One switch that happened in the chaos of a structural breakup at altitude to remain in the correct position. The second bomb told a different and in some ways more disturbing story. It did not deploy its parachute. It came down in a near free fall and struck a muddy field with enough force to bury itself deeply into the soft North Carolina soil. Its tail section separated on impact. Components were scattered across a wide area. The recovery teams that arrived in the following hours began the work of accounting for every piece, and what they found, and in one critical case, did not find, would generate classified reports and internal investigations that took years to fully process. The secondary stage of the second weapon, the thermonuclear core, went so deep into the waterlogged ground that it was never fully recovered. It is there still, beneath a North Carolina field, under an easement the Air Force maintains to this day, a permanent reminder of one January night when the accounting came up short. But it was the first bomb, the one that had come so close, that forced the reckoning. The reports that came back to Sandia National Laboratories, to the weapons designers, to the men who had spent years building the safety architecture of the American nuclear arsenal, were unambiguous. Robert Purifoy and his colleagues read them with the specific, sickening clarity of people who had already suspected the answer and now had confirmation. The safeguards had not performed as the doctrine required. The theoretical layers of protection that the program had relied
upon the assurance that an accident
could not produce a detonation had been reduced in practice to a single point of failure, and that single point had held, not because the system worked as designed, because the system got lucky. What followed was not immediate. Nothing in large institutions moves immediately, particularly when the conclusion being absorbed threatens the foundational assumptions of a program that entire careers and strategic doctrines have been built upon. But the evidence was too specific, too documented, too available to the people with the technical authority to understand it, to be set aside entirely. Purifoy pressed. Others pressed. The language in the internal communications was careful, as institutional language always is when it is approaching something the institution does not wish to fully face, but the direction was clear. The safety systems on American nuclear weapons needed to be reconsidered. The architecture that had been trusted needed to be rebuilt. That process would take years. It would produce a new generation of safety mechanisms, stronger, more redundant, genuinely independent of the sequences they were meant to interrupt. It would eventually result in weapons that could survive the conditions of an accident without progressing toward detonation. The engineering community, given finally the full weight of what Goldsboro had demonstrated, did the work that the doctrine had previously made it easy to defer. But none of that changes what happened on the ground in those first hours. The sun came up over Wayne County. Farmers looked out across fields they had worked for generations and saw something they could not have imagined. Recovery teams moved through the frost, and somewhere in a classified file, a number was being written down, the number of safeguards that had failed, the number that had held, and the distance, measured not in miles but in the difference between 1 and 0. Between that quiet Tuesday morning and the end of everything familiar within 100 miles of where that weapon had fallen, the United States government did not announce what had happened over Goldsboro. There was no press conference, no formal acknowledgement. The official position, maintained for decades, was that the incident had occurred, that the weapons had not detonated, and that the safety systems had functioned as intended. That last part was the careful language of institutions, protecting themselves from a truth they were not prepared to deliver to the public. Because the safety systems had not functioned as intended, they had partially failed. And what had prevented catastrophe was not design but chance. The distinction is not a small one. It is in fact everything. The men who had been on that aircraft carried the night with them in the way that survivors of near impossible things always do, quietly, and not entirely voluntarily. The crew members who survived returned, eventually, to something resembling ordinary life. Major Tulloch was never publicly identified as a failure. He had done what a commander does. The aircraft had broken around him, not because of him. But there are things a person knows about a night that no debrief fully reaches, and the knowledge of what those bombs had been carrying, of how close the sequence had come, is not the kind of knowledge that releases its hold easily. The wider consequences moved more slowly, as consequences of this kind tend to do. The Goldsboro incident joined a classified record of nuclear accidents that the American government had been accumulating since the earliest days of the weapons program, broken arrows, in the military's terminology, a phrase that carries a strange, almost poetic weight for something so purely catastrophic in its implications. There had been others before Goldsboro. There would be others after. Each one produced its internal review, its technical recommendation, its institutional adjustment, and each one tested in a different way. The foundational claim of the entire program, that these weapons could be managed, that the risk was bounded, that the arithmetic was in the end acceptable. In 1969, 8 years after Goldsboro, the Nixon administration quietly ended the Airborne Alert Program. The bombers came down from their constant patrols. The doctrine shifted. The logic of permanent airborne readiness, which had seemed so necessary in the early 1960s, was retired without the public ceremony that might have invited questions about why. Part of the answer was cost. Part was the development of submarine-based missiles that made the bombers strategically redundant, and a part that is difficult to measure, precisely but impossible to ignore entirely, was the accumulating weight of incidents like Goldsboro, of moments when the gap between the doctrine and the reality had become briefly, terrifyingly visible. The field outside Goldsboro is still there. The easement is still maintained. Somewhere beneath the soil below the water table, the components of a thermonuclear weapon that has never been fully recovered continue their slow, anonymous existence in the dark. The people who farm the land around it know the story, more or less. The government marker is not dramatic. The landscape has returned to what it was, and flat, quiet, ordinary in the way that the American South is ordinary, full of sky and distance, and the kind of silence that makes it easy to believe nothing extraordinary has ever happened here. But something extraordinary did happen here, and the reason most of us are alive, to not know about it, is a single switch that stayed in the right position for reasons that no engineer fully designed and no doctrine fully guaranteed. That is how close it was. That is how close it remains. In every era that inherits the weapons of the one before it, not safely distant, not securely managed, close, always, and without exception, close.